In September 1968, Tony Delucci opened a casino directly beside a Harlem church tied to Bumpy Johnson. Within 72 hours, the building was gone. No arrests were made. No violence occurred. The lot stood empty, and Delucci left New York permanently. What happened in those 3 days remains one of Harlem's most calculated displays of power. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories. The building appeared almost overnight. Residents of West 116th Street woke one morning to find construction barriers removed, neon signs installed, and a grand opening banner stretched across a structure that had been dormant for months. The sign read Delucci's Palace in gold lettering. The location was no accident. The casino sat 30 feet from Abyssinian Baptist Church's community center, a building that served as the operational heart of Harlem's social programs. Tony Delucci had purchased the property through a shell corporation 6 months earlier. The previous owner, a textile merchant, had sold quietly and relocated to New Jersey without explanation. Delucci paid above market value and settled in cash. The deed transferred in April. By summer, renovations were underway behind tarps and scaffolding. Most neighbors assumed another apartment building was being constructed. They were wrong. The casino opened on a Thursday evening. Delucci hired a jazz band, offered free drinks for the first hour, and invited local business owners to tour the facilities. Few attended. Those who did left early. The interior featured roulette tables, card games, slot machines, and a full bar. Security guards stood at every entrance. The operation was legal under New York's recently amended gaming statutes, which allowed private clubs to host certain gambling activities if properly licensed. And restricted to members, Delucci had secured every permit. His lawyers had navigated the regulatory framework meticulously. On paper, the casino violated no laws. In practice, it represented a direct challenge to the neighborhood's established order. The church community center ran youth programs, job training, and food distribution. Families visited daily. Children walked past the building on their way to school. The presence of a gambling establishment in that location was not a business decision. It was a provocation. By Friday morning, community leaders had gathered. Reverend Calvin Harris, who oversaw the church's outreach programs, stood on the steps of the community center and addressed a crowd of nearly 200 people. He did not call for protests. He did not threaten legal action. Kay simply stated that the matter would be resolved within the week. When asked how, he offered no details. The crowd dispersed quietly. Across the street, Delucci watched from his office window, confident that his legal protections would hold. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy, had built his reputation over 4 decades. His early years involved the numbers, rackets, territory disputes, and the kind of street enforcement that defined organized crime in the 1930s and 40s. By the 1960s, its role had shifted. He no longer operated in the shadows. He sat on community boards, funded scholarships, and maintained relationships with elected officials, union leaders, and business owners across the city. His connection to Abyssinian Baptist Church ran deeper than philanthropy. Bumpy had grown up attending services there. His mother had been part of the church's hospitality committee. When he returned to Harlem after a prison sentence in the early 1960s, the church became central to his reinvention. He donated generously. He helped secure the property for the community center. He ensured the building had proper funding, staffing, and resources to serve the neighborhood's poorest families. This was not about religion. Bumpy rarely attended Sunday services. His investment in the church was strategic. He understood that power in Harlem did not come from violence or intimidation. It came from infrastructure. The person who controlled schools, job programs, and food distribution controlled the community's future. The church gave him that platform. It gave him legitimacy. gave him access to networks that street operations never could. By 1968, Bumpy's influence extended across multiple boroughs. Longshoremen respected him. Construction unions consulted him. Politicians took his calls. Kay had relationships with judges, police captains, and city administrators. These were not friendships. They were professional alliances built on decades of mutual benefit. Bumpy had provided favors, solved problems, and delivered votes when needed. In return, he received access and consideration. His health was declining. He suffered from heart problems and moved more slowly than in previous years. But his network remained intact. When word reached him that a casino had opened beside the church, he did not react immediately. He made phone calls. He gathered information. He learned who Tony Delucci was, where his money came from, and who had approved the permits. Within hours, he had a complete picture. Delucci was an outsider. He had operated casinos in Atlantic City and Philadelphia, but he had no history in New York. He had no relationships with the families who controlled organized crime in the city. He had no ties to Harlem's business community. He had arrived with lawyers and cash, believing that legal compliance was sufficient. He had miscalculated badly. Bumpy did not need to threaten him. He simply needed to make the casino unviable. And he had exactly the tools to do it. Tony Delucci had built his fortune in Atlantic City during the early 1960s, operating a members-only club that catered to politicians, union officials, and businessmen. The establishment ran smoothly because Delucci understood transactional relationships. He provided a service, collected fees, and maintained discretion. His success came from reading legislation, hiring competent lawyers, and avoiding territorial conflicts with established operators. By 1967, he'd expanded into Philadelphia, opening a second location near the financial district. Both venues operated within legal boundaries, licensed as private clubs under state gaming laws. Delucci saw an opportunity in New York. The city had recently updated its regulations, creating space for similar operations if structured correctly. Harlem appealed to him for economic reasons. Property values were lower than Manhattan's commercial districts, and the neighborhood's growing population represented an untapped market. He had researched the area. He knew about Bumpy Johnson. He knew about the church. He believed both were irrelevant to his plans. In Delucci's assessment, Bumpy was a relic from an earlier era, a street operator whose influence had diminished with age. The church was a community institution, but it held no legal authority over zoning or business permits. Delucci had filed the necessary paperwork, paid the required fees, and received approval from the city. He assumed that was sufficient. His lawyers had assured him the location was defensible. No ordinances prohibited gambling establishments near religious buildings. The church community center was a separate entity from the church itself, which reduced potential legal challenges. Delucci's casino was a private club, not a public venue, which further insulated it from complaints about neighborhood character. Every angle had been considered. Every risk had been assessed. What Delucci failed to understand was that legal compliance and operational viability were not the same thing. A business could possess every permit and still fail if the surrounding infrastructure refused to cooperate. Vendors could decline to deliver. Employees could choose not to work. Utilities could experience delays. Inspectors could schedule frequent visits. None of these actions required breaking laws. They simply required coordination. Delucci had entered a market where he had no relationships and no leverage. He had built his casino in a neighborhood where decades of established networks determined who succeeded and who did not. His confidence in legal protections was about to be tested. On Friday afternoon, two men entered Delucci's casino and asked to speak with the owner. They were not threatening. They wore suits and introduced themselves politely. One was a deacon from the church. The other was a local attorney who handled property disputes. Tish invited them into his office, expecting a negotiation about noise levels or operating hours. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The deacon explained that the casino's proximity to the community center created problems for the neighborhood. Children passed the building daily. Families used the church's programs and felt uncomfortable with a gambling establishment so close. The community requested that Delucci relocate his business to a different part of the city. They were willing to help him find alternative property and would ensure the transition went smoothly. Delucci. I listened, then declined. He explained that he had invested substantial capital in renovations, that his permits were in order, and that he had no legal obligation to move. He appreciated their concerns but could not abandon a location he had purchased legally. The men nodded, thanked him for his time, and left. There were no threats, no raised voices. The exchange was cordial. That evening, Delucci received a phone call from his liquor distributor. The company regretted to inform him that a scheduling conflict had arisen and deliveries to his location would be delayed indefinitely. No explanation was provided. When Delucci called other distributors, he received similar responses. His lawyer assured him this was coincidental and that alternative suppliers could be found. The next morning, 3 staff members called to resign. They offered no detailed explanations, citing only personal reasons. Delucci had hired 12 employees. Total losing 3 was manageable, but replacing them proved difficult. Job applicants, who had seemed eager during initial interviews, failed to show for second meetings. Those who did attend withdrew their applications within days. By Saturday afternoon, a city inspector arrived to review fire safety compliance. The casino passed inspection, but the inspector noted several minor issues that would require follow-up visits. Another inspector appeared later that day to assess plumbing, then another for electrical systems. Each inspection was routine. Each was properly documented. Each required Delucci's time and attention. He began making phone calls to his political contacts in Philadelphia. One did not return his call. Another suggested that Harlem operated differently than other markets and recommended Delucci speak with local representatives. A third admitted he had no connections in that part of New York and could not help. Delucci had not been threatened. No one had broken any laws. But his business was being systematically isolated. Saturday passed with an eerie stillness. The casino remained open, but foot traffic was minimal. A few curious visitors entered, looked around, and left without placing bets. The jazz band Delucci had hired for the weekend canceled, citing a scheduling conflict. The replacement band he found charged triple the original rate and delivered a lackluster performance. By evening, fewer than 20 people had passed through the doors. Delucci spent the day on the phone. His attorney was reviewing options for legal recourse, but admitted that none of the problems they faced constituted actionable violations. Vendors were within their rights to refuse service. Employees could resign at will. Inspectors had legitimate authority to conduct reviews. Everything happening was procedurally correct, which made it nearly impossible to challenge. Across the street, the church community center operated as usual. Families arrived for weekend meals. Volunteers distributed clothing. Children played in the recreation room. No one acknowledged the casino. No one protested outside. The community simply continued its routines, as if the building across the street did not exist. Bumpy Johnson was not seen publicly that day. He remained at his residence on Edgecombe Avenue, making phone calls and receiving visitors. Those who met with him included a union representative from Local 1199, city councilman from the 17th District, and a manager from Consolidated Edison. The conversations were brief. No records were kept, By late afternoon, Delucci's accountant called with concerning news. The casino's insurance provider had sent notice that the policy was under review due to a classification error. Coverage would continue, but premiums would increase substantially pending resolution of the discrepancy. The accountant could not explain what had triggered the review. Delucci began to suspect that his problems were coordinated, but he had no proof. No one had threatened him, no one had made demands beyond the initial request to relocate, yet every system his business relied on was experiencing disruptions. He considered closing temporarily and regrouping, but that would mean admitting defeat. He had invested too much to walk away after 2 days. He decided to wait. His lawyers were confident the situation would stabilize once the initial resistance faded. Harlem was a business district like any other. Markets adjusted. People adapted. Delucci believed persistence would prevail. He was wrong. Sunday morning brought new complications. Delucci's phone service experienced intermittent outages. The telephone company attributed the problem to infrastructure. Maintenance in the area and estimated repairs would take several days. His office lost connectivity repeatedly, disrupting communications with suppliers and contractors. The casino's heating system malfunctioned overnight. A repair technician arrived, inspected the boiler, and determined that a replacement part was needed. The part was on backorder. No timeline for delivery was available. The technician apologized and left. Temperatures in the building dropped steadily throughout the day. Delucci contacted his bank to discuss a short-term credit line for operational expenses. The loan officer he had worked with for years was unavailable. The replacement officer requested additional documentation before processing the request. When Delucci asked why new requirements had been introduced, the officer explained that lending policies had recently been updated. The process would take several weeks. By afternoon, 2 more employees resigned. One cited transportation difficulties. The other offered no explanation. Delucci was now operating with half his original staff. The remaining employees appeared nervous and avoided extended conversations. One cashier mentioned hearing from a family member that working at the casino might create problems, though she could not specify what kind. A health inspector arrived without notice to review food handling procedures. The casino served light snacks and bar food, which required compliance with city health codes. The inspector found multiple violations, none severe, but enough to mandate corrective action within 48 hours. Delucci had 72 hours to address the issues or face temporary closure of the food service operation. His lawyer called with worse news. A tenant group from a nearby building had filed a noise complaint with the city, claiming the casino's late-night activity disrupted residential peace. A hearing was scheduled for the following week. The complaint was procedurally valid, though. The casino had operated for only 3 days and maintained noise levels well within legal limits. Delucci finally understood that he was not facing random obstacles. Every disruption was legal. Every setback was procedurally justified, but the coordination was unmistakable. Someone with access to city agencies, utility companies, vendors, and employees was systematically dismantling his operation without ever directly confronting him. He called the deacon who had visited on Friday and requested another meeting. The deacon agreed to meet Monday morning. Delucci prepared to negotiate. He would not abandon the property, but he was willing to discuss operational compromises, adjusted hours, or community partnerships. He believed some arrangement could be reached. What he did not realize was that the decision about his casino had already been made. Bumpy Johnson's influence in Harlem was not built on intimidation. It was built on decades of carefully cultivated relationships across legitimate institutions. Its network included union officials who controlled labor access, utility managers who oversaw infrastructure, vendors who supplied businesses, and city employees who administered permits and inspections. These were not criminal associations. They were professional relationships maintained through mutual respect and reciprocal assistance. When Bumpy needed a business disrupted, he did not issue threats. He made requests. A union representative might mention to members that a particular employer was not community-friendly. A vendor might decide that delivery routes needed reorganization. A city inspector might prioritize certain locations for routine reviews. None of these actions violated regulations. They were judgment calls made by individuals who trusted Bumpy's assessment of what served the neighborhood's interests. His involvement with the church had strengthened these networks. The community center provided services that city agencies often failed to deliver. Job training programs placed residents in union positions. Food distribution supplemented inadequate public assistance. Health clinics offered care to families without insurance. The center was essential infrastructure, and Bumpy had helped build it. When the casino appeared next to that infrastructure, Bumpy viewed it as a direct threat. Not because gambling was immoral, but because the location was destabilizing. Parents had complained. Teachers had raised concerns. Community leaders had asked for intervention. Bumpy responded by activating relationships he had spent 40 years developing. He called a union organizer and mentioned that casino employees might face difficulties if their workplace became a point of community conflict. He spoke with a utilities manager and suggested that service disruptions in the area might require extended attention. He contacted a city councilman and noted that constituent complaints about the casino would likely increase. Each conversation was brief. Each contact understood what was being requested. Bumpy did not manage the details. He simply set the process in motion. The individuals he contacted made their own decisions about how to proceed. Some delayed services, some increased inspections, some advised employees to seek work elsewhere. The cumulative effect was the systematic isolation of Delucci's business. This was not organized crime in the traditional sense. This was organized community power, wielded by someone who understood that control over daily operations mattered more than control over illegal enterprises. Monday morning, the deacon and attorney returned to Delucci's office. This time, they brought a third man who introduced himself as a property consultant. The conversation was direct. Delucci's casino had no future at its current location. The obstacles he had experienced over the past 3 days would not diminish. They would intensify. His business would fail, not because of illegal interference, but because every legitimate system it depended on would decline to cooperate. The consultant presented an alternative. A group of investors was prepared to purchase the property at the price Delucci had paid, plus 20% to cover renovation costs. The offer was fair and immediate. If Delucci accepted, the sale would close within a week. He would leave Harlem with a modest profit and no further complications. If he declined, the property would become worthless as the business collapsed. Delucci asked who the investors were. The consultant did not provide names. Kay simply noted that the property would be repurposed for community use and that Delucci's cooperation would be appreciated. The offer would remain open until the end of the day. After the men left, Delucci consulted his attorney. The lawyer confirmed that the situation was untenable. Legal remedies would take months and offered no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, operational costs were mounting, revenue was non-existent, and the casino's reputation was already damaged. Fighting would be expensive and futile. Delucci. I made the decision that afternoon. He accepted the offer. The sale was structured through a third-party broker to maintain discretion. Paperwork was expedited. Within days, the transaction was complete. Delucci collected his payment and returned to Philadelphia. He never operated another business in New York. The casino closed immediately after the sale. Staff were dismissed with severance. Equipment was removed. Within 24 hours, the building was empty. What happened next occurred with remarkable speed. Demolition crews arrived on Tuesday morning. The structure was stripped to its foundation by Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday, the lot was cleared, graded, and covered with gravel. No construction permits for demolition were filed. No public notices were posted. The work was completed quietly and efficiently. City officials who might have questioned the process did not intervene. Within a week of Delucci's departure, the casino had been erased. The demolition crew that arrived on Tuesday morning worked with precision. They were employees of a contractor based in the Bronx, hired through a property management company that handled the transaction. The crew foreman had instructions to clear the site completely and prepare it for alternative use. No timeline was provided, but the work proceeded without delays. Interior fixtures were removed first. Slot machines, card tables, and bar equipment were loaded onto trucks and transported to a warehouse in Queens. Some items were later sold to other establishments. Others were scrapped. The removal took less than 6 hours. By Tuesday evening, the building was an empty shell. Structural demolition began Wednesday morning. The building had been constructed in the 1920s, and its framework was solid but outdated. Crews dismantled walls methodically, separating materials for disposal. Brick and concrete were hauled to a landfill in New Jersey. Metal components were sent to a recycling facility. The operation followed standard procedures for urban demolition. With dust suppression and debris containment, neighbors watched from across the street. Some gathered near the church community center, observing quietly as the structure came down. There were no celebrations, no public statements. The community simply witnessed the removal of a building that had briefly threatened their neighborhood's stability. By Wednesday afternoon, only the foundation remained. Crews jackhammered the concrete base and removed it in sections. The lot was excavated to street level, graded smooth, and covered with compacted gravel. Temporary fencing was installed around the perimeter. It's the entire process, from initial clearing to final grading, took less than 48 hours. No city inspectors halted the work. No permits were visibly posted. The demolition occurred with the same efficiency that had characterized the casino's disruption. Systems that might have required documentation or review operated without interference. The project was completed before most residents fully understood what was happening. The lot remained empty for several weeks. During that time, the property was quietly transferred to a nonprofit organization affiliated with the church. The transfer was handled through legal channels, with proper deed registration and title clearance. No public announcements were made. By late October, construction began on a parking facility. The lot was paved, lined, and designated for use by church, staff, and community center visitors. Parking in Harlem was scarce, and the addition provided practical value to families who relied on the center's programs. The facility opened in early November, less than 2 months after Delucci's casino had first appeared. The transformation was complete. A gambling establishment that had operated legally for 3 days had been replaced by a community asset. No laws had been broken. No violence had occurred. The outcome was achieved through coordinated pressure applied by individuals who controlled access to the resources Delucci's business required. The parking lot served multiple purposes. Church employees used it during the week. Community center visitors parked there on weekends. Local residents paid a modest fee for monthly access, with revenue directed to the center's youth programs. The facility addressed a genuine neighborhood need while reinforcing the church's role as a community anchor. The lot also sent a message. Outsiders who attempted to establish businesses in Harlem without community support would face coordinated resistance. Legal compliance was insufficient. Success required relationships, respect for local institutions, and alignment with neighborhood interests. Delucci's failure demonstrated that capital and permits alone could not overcome organized opposition from residents who controlled essential infrastructure. Bumpy Johnson's role in the episode was never publicly acknowledged. He did not speak about the casino. He did not claim credit for its removal. Those who understood Harlem's power structures recognized his involvement, but no evidence connected him directly to any specific action. The dismantling of Delucci's business had been carried out by individuals acting independently, each making decisions within their professional authority. This was Bumpy's legacy. He had built a network that functioned without his direct oversight. Union members, city employees, vendors, and business owners understood the community's priorities and acted accordingly. Bumpy had taught them that power in Harlem came from controlling access to jobs, services, and infrastructure. Those lessons outlasted his direct involvement. The Church Community Center continued to expand its programs. The parking lot enabled greater accessibility, which increased participation in job training, childcare, and health services. Families benefited from the facility daily. The space that Delucci had intended for profit became a tool for community development for years. Afterward, the empty lot and its transformation into a parking facility was referenced in Harlem as an example of collective action. Business owners who considered entering the neighborhood were advised to engage with community leaders first. Developers learned that projects required more than legal approval. They required endorsement from institutions that residents trusted. The story became part of Harlem's oral history, passed down through families and community organizations. Details were often exaggerated or distorted, but the core lesson remained consistent. Local power, built over decades through relationships and mutual support, could outmaneuver outside capital when the community's interests were at stake. Delucci never returned to New York. His Atlantic City and Philadelphia operations continued. But he avoided markets where he lacked established networks. The casino's destruction was not about gambling or morality. It was about control. Bumpy Johnson and the network he had built understood that Harlem's future depended on who controlled its infrastructure. The Church Community Center represented decades of investment in education, employment, and social services. A casino next to that facility threatened to undermine the neighborhood's stability, not through direct harm, but by signaling that outside interests could operate without accountability to residents. Delucci believed that legal compliance provided protection. He had permits, licenses, and attorneys who assured him the business was defensible. What he failed to recognize was that legality and viability were separate conditions. A business could possess every legal right to operate and still fail if the surrounding ecosystem refused to support it. Bumpy's power came from relationships built over 40 years. He had provided favors, solved problems, and earned trust from individuals across multiple sectors. When he needed those relationships activated, he did not demand assistance. He simply asked. The people he contacted understood what was required and acted within their authority. No laws were broken. No coercion was necessary. The system worked because everyone involved shared an interest in protecting the Scusos. The parking lot that replaced the casino was a practical solution to a neighborhood problem. It was also a symbol. Harlem was not a market where outsiders could impose their plans without consequence. Success required engagement with local leaders, respect for community priorities, alignment with the networks that controlled access to labor, services, and infrastructure. Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968, less than a year after the casino incident. His network survived him. The Church Community Center continued to grow. The parking lot remained in use for decades. The lessons from Delucci's failure persisted in Harlem's collective memory. Legal power is formal, Community power is relational. In Harlem, during the late 1960s, relational power determined outcomes. Delucci learned that distinction at significant cost. The casino that stood for 3 days became a parking lot that served the neighborhood for years.